Thank you for joining today's live stream. This is a Tuesday live stream that I host every Tuesday at the same time to talk about digital transformation topics. Today's topic is best of breed in digital transformations. So we're going to unpack this whole concept of basically alternatives to single one system, one size fits all types of systems. So we're going to jump in and talk about best of breed and how that can factor into a digital transformation, what some of the pros and cons are, what some of the considerations are, all that good stuff. I'll introduce our guest here in just a moment, but before I do, a couple logistical things. First of all, this is obviously a live interview, but this recorded interview becomes part of our weekly Transformation Ground Control podcast, which is released every Wednesday with new episodes. So this interview that you're a part of here live today will become part of our Transformation Ground Control podcast that gets released a week from tomorrow. Second thing is we'd love to get your questions as it relates to this whole concept of best of breed and digital transformation. So any questions you have, please drop those in the chat wherever you're watching and listening here today, whether you're on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, or Twitter. We're watching all those streams, and we'll get to your questions. We'd love to hear your feedback and any questions or comments you have as we go through the comments or as we go through the conversation here. And I've got a starting point of questions, but I really would like to get the audience questions first and foremost. That's really what we want to do to make this more engaging. Secondly, if you could, speaking of chat, if you could just drop in the chat where you're joining us from today, what city and country are you in, just so we can get a sense of where this global audience is joining us from here today. Usually we do have a global audience, so we'd love to hear where you're all joining from here today, just so we have that context. So, as I mentioned, our topic today is best of breed in digital transformations, and I'd like to introduce our guest who's been on my podcast a couple times now. I'm excited to have him on again, one of the first podcasts here of the year. And by the way, Happy New Year, everyone. I probably should not skip that important pleasantry to wish everyone a Happy New Year. I hope you all enjoyed the year-end holidays and are looking forward to a successful and prosperous 2023. But joining me here today for our first live stream of the year is Brad Feakes, who's the president of Estes Group. And I'll let him explain who he is and what Estes Group is. But he's going to be here with us talking about this whole best of breed concept. So, Brad, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Eric. Always good to be back.
Yeah, love having you on the show. And we always have great conversations here, not to set the bar too high, but I'm really excited to have you here. And I look forward to diving into some of these topics here. I guess before we jump into this whole concept of best of breed, though, maybe talk a little bit about yourself, your background, as well as what Estes Group does, the company that you work for and are the president of.
Sure. First off, just seeing where everyone's from, let me tell you where I'm from. Born and raised Winnipeg, Canada. Spent the last 25-ish years living in central Wisconsin. My company is out of Loveland, Colorado, but I am coming to you today from somewhere just north of Irvine, California. So I got 4 places. So try to beat that. Estes Group, headquartered in Loveland, Colorado, used to be out of Estes Park, Colorado, and then Estes had a flood and we kind of washed downstream. So we landed in Loveland. We're an ERP-based company. Not so much a system integrator. That's kind of our roots, but we do less and less of that these days. We're focusing more and more on application deployment, a lot of private cloud deployments of ERP systems. I think we talk about SaaS and cloud in the industry as a big deal. And what I'm finding is a significant number of ERP systems still are deploying themselves in private cloud models. That is kind of that single tenancy mode. And so that's kind of where us as an organization, we focused on, is on private cloud, single tenancy deployments of ERP solutions.
Okay, great. Yeah, and Estes is a company that I've known you for quite some time and known the organization for even longer. I think so. It's good group of people there that you've got, and interesting to see your business model evolve as the industry evolves as well. I guess just to start, you started to scratch the surface of this question here, but maybe we could dive a little bit more into it here. But maybe just to start, if we back up, start with the basic fundamentals. What does best of breed mean? I mean, I think it's a pretty vague term. It's oftentimes misused. But how would you describe or simplify that concept for those of us that may not know?
Well, let me tell you how I came to the subject myself. This would have been the mid-aughts. I was working for a company kind of a holding company that was implementing Epicor ERP across the entire branch. This was a company about 600 or 700 million. So it was going to be a pretty big implementation. So I was diving into the literature. We were coming off of Bond 4 at the time. Pretty good system for what it was. And so it was a big shift from Bond to Epicor. And I was in the midst of just trying to figure out ERP itself. I had been an ERP user without really being an ERP understander, if that's a coinage that I can get away with. And so I was going through technology evaluation centers. I think they're still around, diving through all their articles. At the time, they seemed like the best in that space for expositing various different ERP systems and their implications. And one of their concepts that they beat on really hard was this idea of an integrated solution versus a best of breed. And they went back and forth about the pluses and minuses. And that's where my head kind of got into there, because I was coming essentially from two integrated solutions in the purest sense. And this again was in the early aughts, where our technological platforms were very different than they are now. So the whole context of the conversation has changed so markedly from that time. So if I talk about best of breed, they're a very long introduction for a very short answer. I think of it best of breed. There's kind of, again, there's kind of a capital B and there's a lowercase b. Let's talk about the capital B. So the capital B is people who advertise an integrated system saying you need a single point of truth. You need that single database that you can report against, that everybody, it's kind of the tech time for the organization, right? It's keeping everybody on time with a single common set of goals, data, et cetera. Now, a best of breed approach says, well, there's a better way to do it. You're better off taking the best possible functionality from each individual domain that you work in, whether it's production management, inventory management, purchasing, e-commerce, quality management, taking all the best possible functional components and kind of patching them together in order to create your best possible enterprise solution for your organization. So it becomes very decentralized. You don't have a single point of authority because each of these areas masters their own domain. But what you have instead of that is the most robust functionality possible in each of those areas. So I'd say if I were to summarize kind of the hard case for best of breed, that's how I would describe that coming out of the gate.
Yeah, that's a great overview, and it's almost I almost view this best of breed concept as like talking about politics. It's something that's never really going to get settled. It feels like, when you think about, is best of breed better or having.
Well, Eric just fell off the live stream here. Oh, there you go. You disappeared for a second, Eric. So I just kept talking. Sorry about that.
Oh, that's all right. Yeah, there seems to be a connection issue. Hopefully we can. Hopefully it sticks around here for us. But what I was going to say is that the best of breed concept, oftentimes, it's sort of like a pendulum swinging back and forth. There's pros and cons on either side, but best of breed seems like it'll always be a viable option simply because of what you mentioned, which is the sort of the robust functionality that's specialized in one area or one industry or whatever it is. And so while the big guys or the single solutions are trying to be everything to everyone, you've got best of breed providers that aren't trying to be everything to everyone. They're just trying to tackle and attack one problem and do it really well and do it better than the other. So I think that's that's why I equate it to politics. It's almost like there's tension on both sides. There's pros and cons on both sides, and there's purists on both sides and people that feel strongly one side or the other. But in reality, there's a lot of trade-offs on either.
Yeah, I think so. I think the idea of the political metaphor works really well because you kind of have, the wackos on either side of the bell curve, and the rest of us are actually centrists, right? So you take the idea of, I gave you kind of the extreme position on one side. There's also what I call the lowercase best of breed with a lowercase b, and that's more of a situation where you have a central ERP system. It's just the fact that you're willing to bolster that and replace certain areas with best of breed functionality. So let's take since I'm coming from an Epicor world, let's say you have Epicor and you want to use an e-commerce solution to front end that because you do a lot of B2B work. So you end up purchasing an e-commerce system and integrating it with your core system. You'd still consider that a best of breed, but now it's not a decentralized best of breed. So that might be one concept there, centralized versus decentralized best of breed, because you still and it really affects the way you would configure your third-party apps, because now you're relying on that third party to assume that part master record and probably like customer price lists, for instance, would reside in that main central hub. That's still your single point of truth that everything else is working around. I've seen solutions that are built around the lowercase b, especially in e-commerce, where the e-commerce provider says, well, I don't want to have an item master. I want the ERP system to have an item master, and I want to work off of that item master. That's kind of a paradigm I think that's evolved in a lot of areas lately.
Yeah, that's a great point. That even organizations that maybe are shying away from or leaning away from a best of breed model, and they think they want a single system, single ERP system, whatever it may be. Usually even they end up having some sort of best of breed solution, just because it's so hard to find and deploy a system that can do everything you need it to do.
Yeah,
And
and the truth is the ERP vendor is truly giving you a best of breed system more often than not, because so what are best of breed systems happen inside of an ERP vendor? Quite often you'll have third party solutions that a vendor will like so much that they'll buy it, and now they'll license it, and they tell you it's all one comprehensive system, but no, it's truly two systems that are integrated on the back end. So you truly, even if you go through a single vendor, there's a really good chance that you're implementing some form of best of breed solution, or in my parlance, a hybrid cloud, right? Where you have independently installed applications that need to be connected and interacting, that may be living on different deployment platforms. So you end up with a best of breed quite often, whether or not you like it.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you look at the largest ERP vendors in the space. Obviously, you guys have a heavy emphasis on Epicor among other systems. But we look at some of the other vendors as well, like Microsoft, Oracle, Infor. They've grown up largely by acquiring other systems, and over time they struggle with, well, how do we make this less of a best of breed and more of a single integrated solution? In some cases, some vendors are doing better than others. And even SAP, who historically had grown more through greenfield, developing their own products and their own integrated suite of products, even they have been out on an acquisition spree in recent, over the last decade or so, as they bought Ariba and Concur and SuccessFactors and other point solutions that they really are buying to shore up some of the weaknesses of their core solution. So I think it's a great point that most of the large vendors, if not all of them, they really are best of breed. They're trying not to be, but they are. And even if you have a greenfield solution that truly is integrated, you still have individual modules within that system that you've got to figure out how you're going to integrate and how the data is going to flow. So you have a lot of the complexity that best of breed entails. You still have that with the single ERP system model in many cases as well.
Yeah, I think that's pretty common, that even with core modules, say purchasing and inventory, you'll always run into users who aren't entirely happy with how the vendor chose to integrate those models under the sheets. And even when you're not dealing with connected models, but the same code set, all those same questions exist, right? All the different paradigms that say, how does an item flow from this module to that module? What happens when it moves from a purchase order to an inventory record? All of those things are decisions that companies have to make, and we're always living with those decisions, whether or not it's in a best of breed context or a core module context.
Yeah, absolutely. Just turning to the audience here, Kyler, who's my podcast co-host, makes a comment that was a 2-beer question. So she's coming in hot into the new year.
I see that
with beer on her mind still.
I got to go to the customer site when this is done. So 2 beers are definitely. It is California. I'm not sure what's all legal right now. It's probably not on working hours.
I think it's safe to say it's frowned upon in general to drink on the job, but some jobs are different than others, I suppose.
I miss the 80s.
Right. Right. And then just looking to where the audience is here today, I feel like there's a heavy bias toward warm locales, probably because it is freezing cold in Denver where I'm at. So I feel like you included, Brad. You're in LA, Southern California. I'm in cold, snowy, icy Colorado, but we've got Sam from Spain. We have someone from Atlanta, Boynton Beach, Florida, India, London, UK, Hereford, UK, Palm Desert, California. I'm sure that's warmer than where I'm at right now. Northampton, UK, Meeker, Colorado, Austin, Texas, Chicago. So a lot of great representation throughout the world. So I appreciate everyone letting us know where you're from today. There is a question I wanted to get to, though, in addition to shout outs to where everyone's from, this is actually a question from Kyler as well. And that is, building on the lack of a single point of authority, can you talk about the need for interoperability strategies when implementing a best of breed solution? So in other words, how do you make these systems interoperable, or how do you address that whole concept of making sure it just all works and it doesn't end up being a sort of a patchwork or a spaghetti bowl of different systems?
Well, I think she's talking there about a best of bread solution. So I'm high on pumpernickel myself. People in LA are absolute foodies. So if I come to them and say I just like plain wheat bread or something like that, they're not going to let me in the door. So it has to be something like pumpernickel, something classy. So right. Interoperability. Wow, interoperability is one of those words where you can charge your customer by the syllable. I think when I think about connection strategies between applications, there's certainly the deployment strategy concern. First, how does this third party get deployed? I think far and away, these smaller solutions are perfect tailor fit for SaaS. While it can be hard to move a whole ERP system into a SaaS environment, individual best of breed modules quite often play very well in those spaces. E-commerce is probably one of your best examples, where e-commerce over the past 10 years has rapidly moved into SaaS only environments to make that, electronic commerce really, really hum. So it's kind of a natural fit. In say BI solutions, I see a lot of sales oriented BI. BI in ERP seems to play in sales the most often, because salespeople are dumb and need those really simple charts so that they have the pretty colors and the pie graphs. I'm in sales, so I'm allowed to say that.
You can get away with it.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that's one of the keys there is understanding how it gets deployed. Is this an application like a sales BI that needs to live inside of the environment, or an application that can hook on externally? So as soon as you start talking about external hookups, the next concern you have is API performance, because every time you abstract a level in your stack, right, you have your business logic layer. Underneath that, you have maybe your database layer. On top of that, you have this abstracted API layer, which is, doing post calls and such like that. REST is a real fun one. SOAP was a little dirtier, which is ironic. But so you take that idea, the API layers, passing back that data and doing so efficiently at a level that's equal to or better than the base ERP functionality becomes a real concern to people, because if you're in a transaction intensive environment, you might have a perfectly connected system that's logically great, but if it's slow as an ox cart in winter, this is going to be a problem. So how do you deal with those strategies? One is understanding kind of out of the base what kind of baseline performance expectations you can have. 2 and 3 and 4 are testing, and making sure that you're doing adequate testing, not only for functionality, but also for load. I think in any of these cases, it's very easy to get the functional happy path made. And then when you don't realize is that when you take that happy path and you add a lot more pedestrians, suddenly that path becomes very crowded. So I'd say that those are, right out of the gate, a couple of things that I think about that would be, you'd want to be worried about when you jump into a best of breed deployment.
Yeah, and I think it's a theme we're seeing emerge here in the questions from the audience is more addressing some of the concerns, because I think, some of the description that you gave of, single ERP system or single enterprise-wide system versus best of breed, in theory or on paper, the single ERP system just makes a lot of sense. It's one system. You don't have to learn multiple systems. You have one single source of truth, all that stuff that you mentioned. But, I think it's in some cases the benefits of single ERP systems are a bit overstated. And so addressing some of these risks or concerns or trade-offs, I think is really helpful. And a related question is from Malcolm on LinkedIn. Asked another question about best of breed. He says, with best of breed, how do you meet the challenge of coordinating the different system teams to prevent an island of system information where different teams pull in different direction or have different improvement focus or goals? So I guess, in other words, how do you bring together the data, the processes, the operations into sort of a unified operating model, if you will, or technical model as well? How do you do that, or what are some of the implications or considerations as you think about that?
Right. That's a good question. I was thinking about that very question this morning in the shower, do all my best thinking there, and trying to think about how do you get a single single source of data for a company that has a lot of disparate systems. And quite often, I think the easy call is BI, right? Oh, BI will solve that. BI is one of those dump buckets where you can throw any of your problems into the BI bucket during an implementation with the assumption that BI is going to fix it all. And in some cases it does. So being able to create a data warehouse and match all of your disparate systems in a single data set or data view is a real nice, powerful thing to do. Problem, of course, is depending on size of your business and the skill sets within your business, who do you have that can construct, maintain, interpret, and work with that system? So I would say that's, out of the gate immediately, business intelligence becomes kind of at the data level, a place of solving that. Now at the process level, that's really where some of these things get to be harder and more time intensive, I would say, that you have to bring in a lot of people and saying, hey, you're working with these same entities. Now, how do you want to treat these entities? How are we going to act against these entities? If your salespeople require some sort of require a make to stock model so that they can look at stocking levels to present that information to their customer, and manufacturing is looking to address those models in a make to order, you're realizing that the best of breed is actually surfacing business concerns that are unaddressed. So quite often this is, and pardon the metaphor, an opportunity to drain the swamp, right? And understand when you drain that swamp, you surface problems that the business has, that the business truly would have no matter what. But now that you're trying to do something more ambitious, though, those problems become all the more surface. So I would say here, now I'm coming from a business analyst background, so I love the process map and flow charts and putting that all together. I think really you need to do your block and tackle business analysis here to understand what are your business requirements of each department, how do those map together, and then from a system flow standpoint, are you able to get those in sync, or do you run into cases where there are fundamental difficulties? So it's a skill set that if you're going to be taking these things on, it's a skill set that you better hope you have in-house or easily able to acquire it to prevent the unspoken, right? Our fear is always not of the unknown, but of the unspoken stuff that but you don't surface enough. And then it comes out and it bites you when you actually implement. And that's what business analysis in my mind is it's the art of the unspoken, taking those things out and putting them out on the table so that everybody can kind of stare at them and understand the realities there.
Yeah, it's great point and well put. And I think one of the challenges that organizations often face, or the trade-off that's often there, is that from a pure organizational behavior perspective, you have two schools of thought or two ways you could tackle a enterprise-wide digital transformation, whether it's best of breed or not. You have sort of the top-down, approach where you have more at the corporate level, you're setting the overall, vision and direction, and you have a pretty clear, deliberate global digital strategy to tie this all together. And then that's something that usually takes longer. It's harder to get alignment and get everyone on the same page, and it just is a slower process. And then sort of competing with that school of thought is you mentioned sales guys or salespeople, just using them as an example and continuing to pick on them because I'm a sales guy too, so I can pick on our people or our types. But one of the considerations, if you're in a sales organization, let's say, and you have an immediate problem or pain point you're trying to solve with technology, you can go out and buy Salesforce or some CRM system to immediately tackle your problem without really having to consider what does the rest of the organization need. As long as you can tie that data back to the rest of the organization, you can move forward quicker in many cases and oftentimes at a lower cost. So I think that tension organizationally is where a lot of companies struggle. Is like, do we take that deliberate global view, top-down approach to digital transformation, or do we let individual business units or functions sort of define what their technological needs are and move forward with it? Mm-hmm. And that tension, I think, is something that organizations struggle with. What do you see in that case? I mean, with your customers and your clients, what is there a preferred school of thought, or do you see clear advantages?
Well, I'm coming from a Lean Six Sigma background. Before I got into IT, I was in Lean Six Sigma, and especially in the lean world, it was very much a bottom up. The top line, the folks at the top in a perfect lean environment were empowering people to make changes, right? All right, we need to do better. I'm going to empower you to do better. I'm going to give you the tools to do better. Go run with it. And you have the power to change your business within this circumscribed space to do that. And I liked that idea a whole lot, but I also saw a lot of cases where you empower people who don't have the tool sets to be successful. It's really dangerous and can create
Mm.
some ginormous disasters. Some of the biggest disasters I've seen in business process and system implementation are putting people in kind of the Peter principle, right? Putting them outside of their ability to achieve, and empowering the wrong people. So the big challenge there. So there's a definite tendency to want to, out of a sense of control from a managerial perspective, to kind of oversee and kind of play the puppet master and have all those pieces on the chessboard. I don't know if a marionette could play chess or not. It'd be an interesting thing to watch. But the idea then would be that you're overseeing that with that global vision. The problem with global vision, of course, is that it tends to be very myopic, and it doesn't know enough granularity to say, oh yeah, Salesforce is going to fit. As a guy who's moving off of Salesforce in 3 months, I get the idea that Salesforce may not be the best fit for every organization. So you could make a quick kind of pencil whip that decision, go industry best practice. And I mean, you've talked at length, Eric, about how industry best practices are often just marketing jargon. So I think there's a big concern there that if you're doing a top-down approach, that you're getting enough feedback loops at the lower levels so that your top-down decisions are both informed and not going to badly jar up the folks who are impacted by that.
Yeah, great point. And you sort of open up another can of worms or Pandora's box, depending on how you want to look at it. But the concept of it. So we're talking largely about technology here, right? Whether you have single system or multiple systems, and that's on the surface what we're talking about. But if you dig deeper, what we're also talking about is the culture of your organization. What kind of culture is this going to drive? Because one thing we see that organizations struggle with is, here's who we are today. Today we are a best of breed environment, and everyone's had a lot of flexibility, let's say, and we've been pretty decentralized. We have not been a command and control type of organization. But then we grow to a point where we acquire all these companies and deploy all these different systems where it becomes a mess. And now we've got to figure out, how do we drive additional scale and efficiency? And one of the answers, or potential answers to that, is let's replace all those best of breed multiple options with one single system that gives us a common operating model, which, again, that's a technical decision, but it's also a cultural decision. Is that who you want to be? Is that the right answer for you as an organization? And so I think that's something that organizations oftentimes separate erroneously. They separate the technical discussion from the cultural discussion. I think you have to look at both to see what is it you're trying to become, and how will this technological option, whichever path you go down, how will that affect your culture, and is that aligned with what you're trying to do as an organization? Is that something you've seen or that resonates with you as well?
Yeah, for sure. It's funny because it kind of recontextualizes the archetypal disastrous organization where everybody's managing stuff in spreadsheets and Access database and
Right.
Lotus notes, and they're all kind of flowing together in a big jumbled mess. I guess you could call that a best of breed or a worst of breed. I don't know what you want to call it, but I think definitely when you deal with situations where you're taking away someone's Access database, I would say that I'm in a world where the Access database is kind of like the sacred cow, and you're running into situations where folks are, I have such control here. I have all these things that I have that I don't have when you pull me into an integrated system or not a single user system. So there's certainly a lot of cultural challenges that you're going to run into whenever you're replacing that level of functionality. Because I know there's certainly in prior generations a lot of applications that would have been counted as third-party applications that this goes back to my own background, where a web maintenance management solution, the maintenance department wanted to keep this maintenance management solution and integrate it with ERP for purchasing and inventory management, etc. Problem was, it was sitting on an Access database. And linking an Oracle database to Access is about as ugly as you want to get. So you run into these kinds of situations where you might be empowering the department, but that department might be dragging everyone down. So if you can come up with some consistent set of principles and try to sell those basic principles of, we need to be technologically in a forward-looking manner, that because they deal with physical technology all the time. If you tell them, well, what you have is sitting on something that's going to drag this whole piece down. This is just adding friction to the organization, and you can sell them on the value of updated technology. I think that's key, is starting with those basic principles and trying to, trickle those down into the individual decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great point. What about this? Here's another related question. Again, coming back to the concern, or how do we address one of the potential deficiencies of a best of breed model. But in the best of breed model, do you have system integrators or implementation partners for each system? And then how does effective project management come into play for alignment and coordination? So in other words, you've got disparate pieces potentially, or disparate technologies you're trying to deploy. Who deploys them? Is it one single party? Do you have multiple SIs or implementation partners? And on top of that, how do you coordinate all that and make it sort of a cohesive strategy and deployment plan?
Yeah, that's a good one because we feel that real personally because we're responsible for configuring a lot of third-party apps in the work we do. So basically, in our world, every private cloud of ours ends up being a hybrid because we operate in a world where there are a lot of third parties, and quite often the customer doesn't actually know how much they have that is truly not part of the core system. And we have to configure or connect systems that have already been configured. That's probably a way of putting it, is that we connect it so that it operates however it operated when it was originally configured in the original environment. Sometimes that's very hard to do because of the lack of information, and you really do need to bring the vendors involved. So to the original question about implementing initially, I would recommend that you're implementing third-party systems not all as a big bang. If you're trying to implement a base ERP system and 5 integrations at the same time, you're going to be a ball of spaghetti by the time you're done. It's going to be such a mess. So I try to keep core functionality, like essential implementation functionality. I'm in LA this week. We're implementing a system, and we kind of worked through that idea of how do you get the system to do just what it needs to do to go live so that you minimize that amount of complexity and risk, and then start to build onto that structurally. I think in marketing, we call that the minimal acceptable product, right? What's that minimal acceptable product to get you live and get you moving? So the fewer systems you try to implement in parallel, the better. I think that's a fair statement. That may not always be practically possible, but I think it's something you try to do. Now, in terms of vendor engagement, I think vendors are quite often, especially with these third-party systems, they don't have a deployment community as much as maybe an ERP would have. Their partner community is much smaller. So pulling in the vendors is huge. Even in our work with the migrations, getting the vendor involved is a great asset to us. And we try to build good vendor relationships to keep that strong, because the first thing, from a cloud migration, the biggest thing that'll deploy you is a unresponsive or unhelpful vendor. You really want to be careful there. I'd say build vendor relationships early, keep them maintained as your system goes on. And yes, you probably will find that you're going to have to use them to do certain things in the application. And we do that all the time. We're giving access credentials to different vendors so that they can get in, do their stuff, and get out, so that we're not an extra link in the chain when we're trying to implement these things.
Yeah, and you really have to watch out for that potential finger pointing too. If you have, let's say, 3 or 4 different implementers or implementation partners deploying different technologies, it's really easy if there's a weak link somewhere in that chain, one of the partners isn't as good as the others or is creating problems that are cascading to other parts of the transformation. It's really easy to just start pointing fingers, and then all of a sudden the question becomes, well, who's responsible here? I mean, you've got 3 or 4 different parties, maybe too many cooks in the kitchen. And that's where it puts a lot of pressure or more pressure on the overall program management and governance of the overall project, back to the original question or point that Kyler was making. So I think that's something to think about as well, is just the trade-off that goes along with that, and just recognizing that for the advantages you gain with best of breed, potentially with having better point solutions that are presumably better fits functionally for that specific area, you've addressed that problem, but now you've created other problems now, which is back to the question, which is the coordination and the program management and governance, the architecture. Having a solid enterprise architect that can figure out how this all ties together is super important as well.
Yeah, I think so. I was thinking about this the other day, just in prep for this, how a best of breed approach, which seems to be the winning approach going forward, it really forces end users to have a much broader skill set than they would have had 20 years ago. And especially in worlds where IT departments are shrinking generally. I don't see trends that tell me that IT departments are growing, right? So the people who would traditionally be right in the middle of this, trying to organize and make sure that you're organizing an implementation successfully so that you're minimizing finger pointing, right? Keeping transparency, et cetera. Those people are going away. So what does that mean for other people in the organization? Do sales managers now need to have implementation skills, project management skills, business intelligence skills? All those things start changing the nature of the work we're doing, because we find that those people on the peripheral of system implementation are getting pulled in, more and more to help in those areas.
Yeah. Yeah. Another dynamic, too, that comes to mind is that you look at the strategies of some of these best of breed providers, and I think some of the strategies are further muddying the waters, or creating even a blurrier line between single ERP system versus best of breed. And just as a couple examples, if you think about Salesforce, we were talking about them earlier, as well as Workday. Salesforce and Workday. Salesforce is historically a CRM or Salesforce automation type of system. Workday has historically been more of an HR technology sort of system. But in both cases, both vendors are sort of moving or branching out of their core functional focus and becoming more of an ERP-ish sort of solution. Salesforce has their Force platform where you can have third-party developers creating all different types of solutions that can provide more broad ERP capabilities on the Force platform. So Salesforce is sort of morphing into a potential ERP system, and same with Workday. They started off as HR technology. They still are very good at that, but now they also do financials and other stuff too. Mm-hmm. So, I think that further muddies the water too. It's not as black and white as it sounds, as maybe we queued up this conversation to sound. There's a lot of gray areas of sort of more hybrid, or sort of like somewhere in between best of breed and single ERP systems as well.
Oh, that's a funny point you make, because about a month ago, Estes Group hosted a full day third-party webinar where it was all circled around the Epicor Profit 21 distribution ERP. So we brought in 8 providers from the community, folks we had met at the conference and had drinks with, and after a few drinks, we decided we were friends. So we brought them all in the same room, and everybody got a slot to present on an industry topic and do a little bit of dog and pony show with their own systems. And it dawned on me, none of these providers are providing single solutions. Many of them are providing multiple in the way you talk about that. So a document management solution may also be providing AP automation. They may also be providing AR automation. Now, they're next to a credit card provider who is also providing AR automation. They don't have AP, but they have AR. And you keep going down the list. Each of these providers is broadening their skill sets to the point where we tried to basically come in and keep as little competition as possible between vendors, to try to just keep the waters merry, and realize that was almost impossible to do, because all these Venn diagrams started overlapping in strange ways that were unexpected. So you think that okay, we'll keep our e-commerce partners on separate sides of the table, but their offerings extend beyond e-commerce, because they look at this, say, now, well, I've already built this integration platform for e-commerce. Why don't I stretch it out a little bit laterally, and now I can make a global integration platform that any solution could use? And now you find that one vendor is using another vendor's tool sets to provide their services, and yes, it becomes inbred in a hurry.
Yeah, and it's back to the point of coordinating across multiple vendors and multiple implementation partners. Sometimes what you see too is, as that landscape evolves of what a vendor can truly do and how their technology tends to expand outside of their maybe myopic focus to begin with, you start to get a lot of that competition that you were alluding to before, that vendor competition where one of the vendors involved thinks that you should be using more of their software and less of one of the other provider software. And it can become messy, and it can become, if you don't have a clear vision of what you're trying to accomplish and why you're doing what you're doing, mm-hmm. you're going to become prey to or victim to just whatever sales messaging happens to win out, or whoever the best salesperson is going to be, and that doesn't necessarily align with what your business needs are.
Sure. I mean, every vendor has a land and expand strategy, right? I think that's pretty safe to say that that's just a business principle that we all abide by. And everyone's thinking, if I can get my foot in the door in this one area, hopefully I can branch out otherwise. And this kind of goes to Kyler's comment about how do you know if an organization that a best of breed solution versus a full ERP system is right for them? I think really you're asking that same question all the time, whether it's a land and expand to get their foot in the door somewhere else, is really what are your requirements as a business? I think companies that find themselves going down bad paths most often are the ones that least understand their own business requirements. It's all kept at an intuitive level. What I like about, say, guys like Third Stage, when you go in with a company and you flush that out, you really make people kind of answer questions about what they are as a business. I'm working with a customer right now that transformed over the course of their ERP implementation from a pure job shop, custom shop to a much more standard configure to order or make to stock, make to order model over the course of their ERP implementation, just because the ERP system itself surfaced all these questions that they hadn't asked about your business. So I think really understanding what's the best direction to take really starts with a good understanding of what you need, and then a good understanding of what the options are out there and how well they work to map to your systems. I'd say within any of these worlds, if a vendor really wants you to buy their product, they're going to go out of their way to try to demo their product solving your problems. And if you can come to them and help them understand what your problems are, I think you shorten that distance to coming to a good, clear solution as to whether or not a third-party solution can handle what you need from them.
Yeah, yeah, that's very, very well said. And just getting to some of the audience questions and comments here, just to sort of validate or reconfirm what we talked about before. This is from Ryan on LinkedIn. He says, in my experience, vendors love to pass off any tech connection data loss issues to other software vendors in the best of breed setup, which is what we were talking about earlier as well. How do you handle quality assurance and tech issues across the system that is mostly disparate in nature? And I think that sort of gets back to what we were talking about, which is this came in around the same time as the other question came in, sure. Similar to that. But that's where that project governance and having a PMO or some sort of overarching management of the different parties and the different applications, as well as the enterprise architecture and integration, and having that sort of central hub of program governance, program management and governance, as well as architecture. That is one way to tie that all together, and easier said than done, of course, but that is one way to go about that.
For sure.
Here's an interesting question. I think is more of a strategic, where is the world heading sort of a question. This is from YouTube. And the question is, will giant ERP systems need to break up into multiple microsystems? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's an interesting question. Yeah, that is. Boy, this goes back to the early aughts. Remember when service-oriented architecture was all the rage, and I spent way too much time trying to figure out what that actually meant, only to realize that the only people who were writing about it were marketers and not actual technicians. That was a big waste of time. We shouldn't read. We should read much less in life. I'm a big believer in no words in our life. Microsystems. Gosh, I see a lot of small providers that create micro services for bigger systems. Now, should bigger systems themselves kind of break up themselves into a best of breed so that you could buy a SAP inventory management system that interacted with a true best of breed patchwork, right? So I only bought SAP for the inventory. Everything else, I went elsewhere. That's an interesting thought. And it was kind of tickling the back of my brain as we were talking whether or not ERP systems would configure themselves to go in that direction. I know they talk a good game about it, but I wonder if if vendors would find themselves encouraged to do that, if they would see that as a land and expand strategy, or if they would think they're giving away too much in apportioning that out. It'd certainly be a neat thing to see. And I don't have any real world examples where a company's used an ERP system for just one tiny spot outside of maybe finance, right? And those are normally failed implementations. So we were best of breed because we failed at everything else. So we only implemented finance. That, I guess you could count that, but you never really want to, not vocally anyways.
Yeah, it's a great point. Some deployments end up becoming best of breed when they were intended to be single ERP systems, and vice versa too. It's a great point. And I think I really do think, though, back to the point I made earlier about it's almost like a political debate. I think we could sit here all day and argue politics, and probably neither one of us would win. And some people would agree with you, some would agree with me. I think the same thing is true with best of breed and ERP. I think there's strong arguments to be made for both sides. But not only that, but over time, the evolution and the tension between the two, I think it's just there's so many distinct pros and cons, and companies, as they evolve and ebb and flow in their growth journeys, are going to gravitate towards one or the other, and that pendulum is going to swing back and forth. So I just feel like it's one of those things that's just never going to go away. We're always going to have this debate, in my opinion.
I think so.
Because I don't see how you solve, because you can't, until some magical technology that I don't know about comes out that solves all the problems of both sides of the spectrum, I don't see how the debate ever really settles itself.
No, and I think the thing that stays current across this discussion is what you've talked about with governance, because it's kind of like in political world we talk about kind of two different parameters. One's ideology and one's efficacy, right? You might vote for someone because you like their ideology, but they're incompetent at what they do, so they're not even able to achieve their goals because of the lack of competence. Now, so
Right.
I think what we can all agree on is that we want competent governors in our world. I would say that is the idea in an IT system. Whether or not you're going best of breed or you're going single solution, you need governance inside of that. You need thoughtful management making those decisions, and that applies, across the board, because either solution can be executed miserably if you lack those core government skills. The things that we talked about: business analyst skills, flowing data mapping, test case development, execution, all those kind of nuts and bolts capabilities that are applicable regardless of the ideology. I think if you're missing those things, you're in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, I totally agree. And here's a question that sort of continues to build on the theme here of sort of the how to address some of the concerns with best of breed. This is from Sam on LinkedIn. And Sam says, with best of breed, do companies have to set and agree to rules that reduce the risk of decisions taken on one department impacting on others? For example, what if finance wants standard costing and operations wants actual costing? So that's sort of getting into the end-to-end business processes and the overall operating model of the organization. Do you centralize some of that decision making in the process definition, even in a best of breed environment, or do you leave that as sort of a decentralized function by function or location by location set of decisions? What have you seen in that regard?
When it's done successfully, there's always a degree with, if not the decisions are centralized, the decision-making process is. When you're working in an ERP system, you're implementing, and you run into those core critical issues, you throw those up on your critical issues list and you circle back on them quickly to say, hey folks, finance wants to go average costing, manufacturing wants to go standard. Let's flush this out and come to a single agreement, because in absence of a single agreement, you're going to have just a mess. So I think you really need, if we don't call it centralization, it's collaboration, it's communication, whatever kind of buzzword we want to stick on our bumper, is really in its absence, you're going to create a nightmare. So I like that idea of ground rules. It's kind of like when you get a core team together and you set the ground rules. This is how we're going to operate. This is what is acceptable, what isn't. I think that's a great idea to have those and to be kind of revisiting those ongoing.
Yeah, and I think Sam's question brings up another important point, which is whether you're going with a single system, a single ERP system, or a best of breed model, or somewhere sort of in between, you still have to define those end-to-end processes to figure out how it's all going to flow together, and whether or not that's a centralized, top-down command and control sort of imposition of new processes, or whether it's done from the bottom up, or however that's done is a different conversation. We could spend a whole live stream just talking about that. But I think that's still something that you have to do. And best of breed isn't going to solve that problem, and neither is a single ERP system. You still have to define those end-to-end process flows and know, what basically what you want to be when you grow up. I mean, you have to define that so you can use technology in that way.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And here's a comment from Kyler again. Project manifestos are critical for alignment. So project charter and having a solid unified project plan, all that stuff is certainly important.
Whenever I hear manifesto, I start thinking Karl Marx, and
I was just thinking that too.
Being a college sophomore and thinking, but we can keep going.
It's because I keep bringing up politics, and so it's hard not to think when manifesto comes up. It's hard not to think of Karl Marx. So what about, we haven't talked a lot about cloud deployment options, which may sound unrelated to best of breed, but it is related. Let's talk about that for a minute. What are some of the hybrid or what are some of the options available for cloud deployments, whether you're in a best of breed environment or not?
Well, okay. So from a foundation standpoint, you really have kind of three basic options. You have software as a service, which is, and again, you can probably stretch that out in its extreme. It's completely vendor supplied without applications backend configuration. You're consuming it strictly as a client. That would be software as a service. So it's deployed out in the cloud. You don't know where. It doesn't really matter to you as a customer. That's one model of both cloud deployment and subscribing to the application. Because normally in this model, you're subscribing to the software on a monthly basis versus buying a perpetual license. On the other side, you have your traditional on-premise licensure. In that case, you've bought the license. It's a perpetual license. You buy it once, you own it forever. You pay recurring support, but you own the software and you deploy it on a local box. Now, probably the center point in between that would be some version of private cloud where you take an on-premise license and you deploy it into a private cloud environment so that it's like an on-premise, except you're not dealing with all the hardware challenges that come with, building a data center locally. Now there are versions on either side which kind of float around that. You could co-locate where you own the hardware but you don't own the data center, or you could have a private cloud SaaS where you subscribe to the license but it's deployed into another encapsulated environment. So the lines blur with all the different kind of sub options in between. Every time I talk to a new ERP vendor, they'll have different models. Some ERP vendors work through third parties to actually deploy. So I'm going to buy it from vendor A, but I'm going to deploy it through software provider B, even though it's a subscription, because the deployer and the vendor have some sort of relationship where they're paying each other for good graces and all of that. So, contractually, you can divide this in a lot of different ways. The key is how you have it deployed affects how you can integrate with it. So if you're in a SaaS environment, a pure SaaS where you're all web-based, essentially you're stuck in a situation where you're working through API layers in order to make connections. So you need to be cognizant of, if I've bought a solution that's purely SaaS-based, my integrated systems need to be able to communicate at that level. Vendors are kind of scrambling right now to build connection points that operate on multiple levels. So you have an on-premise or a private cloud version, and then you also have a API outside pure SaaS version. I think this is where I went back to the performance challenges, because the vendors that I talk to struggle with pure API communication because the APIs aren't as they don't perform as robustly. So you end up with some of those challenges inside of there. But really, if you're integrating, you're trying to mitigate security risk in your connections whenever possible. That's one of the benefits with a high level connection, because if it's an API, a handshake, a certificate-based handshake, that takes away a lot of the other risks in terms of getting access to lower levels of your system. So you definitely need to, really the biggest challenge right now quite often has to do with on-premise customers who find themselves getting ransomed because they have too many holes in their firewalls. And they end up becoming our customers because they want someone else to manage that firewall level and start whitelisting and closing some of those portholes, et cetera, and be much more careful about what information can get through. For me, that's probably, from a security standpoint, is an area that will be an ongoing concern for third-party integration applications, because as hackers get better at masking their calls as vendor calls, and as hackers get better at knowing what software you're subscribed to, they can make their calls much more targeted, which is a little scary.
Yeah, and man, you just hit a couple things. We could spend an hour on a couple of the things you just mentioned, but let's talk about cybersecurity just for a second. The best of breed model, one of the vulnerabilities or potential vulnerabilities of best of breed is you could have tightened up security in 90% of your ability or some sort of breach. Now suddenly you've exposed that breach, and that breach now could potentially extend into other core systems. And I think that's what we've seen with some larger organizations that have had some major cybersecurity breaches. Is it wasn't their core system, their main system that was hacked. It was some third-party bolt-on that had weak security, and they use that as an entry point to get to some of the core data of the organization. So I think that is something to think about. It's never a single ERP system doesn't solve all the problems, but I think you have more risk of that with a best of breed model. Is that something that you've seen as well?
I would say decisively yes. It's kind of like if your ship is patched together from many pieces of steel that are welded together, you have a much higher chance of leakage, right? Versus if you have a single sheet of metal, it's much harder to puncture through. And I think that metaphor sticks. And you want to be very careful that security concerns are part of this conversation, because it's very easy. I run into folks in the industry who get ransomed twice a year. And it blows my mind that companies are sometimes able to stay in business when they are this porous.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. And I like that metaphor too. That's a great visual metaphor for some of the risks there. I have one last question for you, Brad, just in the interest of time. But before I ask you this question, I have a question for the audience. If you could just drop in the chat, I'd love to hear or see sort of your knee-jerk reactions based on everything we've talked about so far and based on maybe what you already know about best of breed versus single ERP system. If you had to vote or choose right now, just drop in the chat. What direction do you think is best? If you had to pick one right now, is it best of breed or is it single ERP or single system? I'd love to just sort of get a gut check here of which side of the debate might be winning or losing here, just because I'm competitive like that and I just like to know. But while people are dropping that in the chat, we'll come back and kind of look at how people respond to that question. Question for you then, Brad, is as organizations and people within the organizations are trying to determine which path is best for them and how do I get started on a digital transformation, and I'm overwhelmed by all these different options and different directions I could go. How do you recommend that an organization get started on navigating this decision and just getting started on their transformation in general?
Well, I think it's the idea there goes back to governance and finding someone to help you with your process of governance. And if you have that organized, then you start as a function of a healthy governance process, you start churning out what are the priorities that you want to start addressing. And from there, you find yourself in the software selection cycle. I think really critical there is finding folks who can help you get through that cycle for each of these solutions, so you don't find yourself going down, one path or another. So it starts with governance, and it starts with good help. So if you got folks internally who've gone through that, have those skills, great, leverage them. If you don't have those, I think you want to look outside and find folks like Eric. I mean, you guys have done a very nice job helping folks through that. And I've pulled you in at times when we need a objective view of the market and its options, so that we're not taking someone down a pre-prescribed path. And for that fella there, no, I am not a butcher. I don't know if he's a butcher. I like Billy Butcher, The Boys, good show. I'll watch anything with Carl Urban in it, but no, I do not butcher. I'm not a vegan either. Somewhere in between, like we say, there's two poles, right? There's Billy Butcher on one side, there's radical veganism on the other. I think I fall somewhere in between.
Yeah, I wasn't sure where that question was going, which is why I didn't pull it up. But since you brought it up, yeah,
those are often the best.
They often are. I just didn't know where to take that one, so I'm glad you saw that too in the chat. Now, what's interesting, just to sort of wrap it up, I think that's great advice, by the way. Just getting that objective view of what the best direction is for you. Recognizing, I'd say first and foremost, recognize that neither one of these answers is perfect, and you're going to have some trade-offs, and it's going to be imperfect, and there's going to be some pains of whatever decision you make that might make you second guess that decision. But I think the key is to really understand, go in with eyes wide open as to what those pros and cons are, and also getting that objective, unbiased view. Because I guarantee if you're, let's just say you reach out to SAP, call SAP, call a sales rep and say, what should I do? Should I implement S4 HANA across my entire organization, or should I go with more of a best of breed approach? I can almost guarantee, and I would bet money, even though I hate betting and I never do bet, I would bet money that SAP is going to tell you a single ERP system. Absolutely. You don't want best of breed. It's a terrible idea. Here's all the things wrong with it. Right. And they're going to sell you on sort of the slanted view of that. So I think it's important to know that as an input, but you do have to recognize that there's a lot of bias in the industry based on whatever product or service you're trying to sell. So having that objective and technology agnostic view is important. And that is, to your point, thank you for the shameless plug, Brad, but that is something that my company does, which is Third Stage Consulting. That's something we do to help clients through the process. Now, going to the responses here, I'm actually a little surprised by it. I'll be honest. I thought in my mind, we'd probably get an overwhelming response that single system is the way to go, just because we've spent a lot of time here today talking about some of the weaknesses and deficiencies that need to be addressed in the best of breed model. But I think a slight majority, this is not scientific, this is just me scrolling through the comments, I'd say a slight majority is probably leaning towards best of breed. But my favorite response from someone who knows me very well is Kyler says it depends. And I totally agree with that, by the way. That would be my vote, is I can't choose one or the other. It depends. And being a consultant too, I don't have an organization that I'm trying to, deploy or make this decision for other than our clients. And with our clients, it does depend. But I'm curious, is curious to see people that are in organizations that are maybe considering technologies, which sort of knee-jerk reaction they have there. So I guess maybe I'll ask you, Brad, what if you had to choose, what would you choose? What do you think the best answer is? I
If
know it does depend, but if you just had to
sure,
make a blanket statement, stereotype or whatever,
yeah.
generalization, what would it be?
If I had to choose, I would choose an ERP system. So I would go single system with a vendor who is an ERP vendor that is constructed for integrations
Hmm.
to allow me to do my. So another way of saying, I probably like the lowercase b. I like a centralized system that is bolstered by third party systems. So I'd want to make sure my centralized systems is really conducive to that. Are they building a robust REST API? Do they already have it built? How does it scale versus regular business process? Ask those questions of your vendor, because then if you find a single vendor as your single point and you don't need to expand, okay, you got your one system. If you feel you need to, now you can branch out and expand and kind of pick and poke as needed. So that's my middle path through all of that.
Yeah, you're hedging. You're hedging your bet. I like it.
Whoa,
You're sort of saying it depends without saying it depends. You're just sort of
exactly.
taking that middle ground there, which I like. And I think that's a fair, probably a good approach and maybe a good starting point for a lot of organizations to start sort of in the middle there, and maybe a lean, the spectrum, you lean one way or the other depending on, what your needs are and your what it is you're trying to drive from an organizational perspective. So it's a great point there. Well, great. This is a great discussion, Brad. Really appreciate having you here today. I appreciate all the great questions and feedback from the audience, too. This was a very engaged crowd. Maybe
Yeah.
the holidays and the rest and relaxation leads people to being fired up and ready to talk digital transformation. So that's a encouraging start to 2023. So thank you for that. And again, Brad, thanks for being here today. Really appreciate it.
Oh, you bet. I love these sessions, Eric. Anytime.
Yeah, lots of fun. We'll have you again on soon, I'm sure. And want to thank everyone for being here every Tuesday, same time, same place. We're on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Twitch as well, which is where the Butcher comment came in, is from Twitch, by the way. I always forget that we were also streaming to Twitch, but we stream to all those platforms every Tuesday. This interview becomes part of the Transformation Ground Control podcast that I host each week. This will be part of the episode that's released a week from tomorrow. Every Wednesday, we have new episodes of Transformation Ground Control. And this interview becomes part of next week's episode once we polish it up and add some other stuff to it and put it in a podcast format. So thank you, everyone, for being here. Have a great week. Happy New Year. I hope everyone's year is off to a great start so far. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time on our live stream. So have a great week in the meantime, and we'll see you all soon.
Very good. Thanks, chat.
All right. Thanks, Brad.